if you could expound for the viewers, this kenosis passage is Philippians chapter 2, starting in verse 6, I believe, and going on down the page.
I would love to, and you just, what you're going to have to do is step on my toe if I start preaching too much, though, because this is one of the most beautiful passages of Scripture in all the Bible. It is one of the plainest references to the deity of Christ. And I remember sitting with two pioneer ministers. You know who pioneers are amongst Jehovah's Witnesses. Yes. Two women pioneer ministers. And I remember going through this, what's called the Carmen Christi, the hymn to Christ as God, and using it to help them to understand what the New Testament teaches about the deity of Jesus Christ. And I remember looking at one lady, she was sitting just over to the right of me. I remember looking in her eyes. And when I got to the point of explaining what the whole point of this passage was, I saw it hit her. Mm-hmm. It was the wall going up, and it scared her. She saw exactly what the passage was talking about.
You mean the wall going down?
No, it was the wall coming up. She saw what I was talking about.
Oh,
and it scared her. She had never seen it before. She physically sat back when she realized what the passage was talking about.
You know, I've seen that many a time myself, either with this passage or with that passage dealing with the beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega, and Revelation. There's those passages in Revelation 21, 20. But
there are so many passages.
It's outstanding.
Let me look at
Go
this.
ahead.
The important thing, there are two things. First of all, you're right in that verse 10 is pulling from Isaiah 45:23, which again is about Jehovah. That to Jehovah the knee will bow, and so on and so forth. But before you ever get to that wonderful thing, I like to use verses 4 through 9 to help the Jehovah's Witness understand the natures of Christ. Mm-hmm. The fact that you have one person with two natures, the divine and the human. And Philippians chapter 2 is great in doing that, because the first thing you've got to do with this passage, you must do with this passage, is say, now what is Paul talking about here? And you read through verses 3 and 4, and you explain the humility of mind with which Christians are to treat one another. We are to be concerned about others. And this topic of humility, what is it to be humble? It's to have certain rights. I have certain rights as a Christian, but I lay these rights aside in service for others. That's what humility of mind is all about. And Paul brings up as his classical example of what it is to act in humility of mind toward others, Jesus Christ. Verse 5, have this mind in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Okay, here's my example, Philippians. Here is what I'm going to tell you about in regards to how it is that you're to be humble. Jesus Christ is our example of humility. In verse 6 he says, who existing in the form of God did not regard equality with God something to be grasped or held onto. Now the New World Translation gives the most wooden, horrific, horrible translation of this passage that I've ever seen in any translation in the world. It is absolutely juvenile in nature. It is so bad from any standpoint. English, Greek, it's bad in Swahili. It is bad in every language you could possibly put it into, because it's just absolutely torturous the way that they put it.
I think we're dealing here with the New World Translation with people who actually know what they're doing. They are intentionally deceiving those who will be reading this text.
That's right.
They know what it says, but they do not want the truth of what the text says to get to the people, so they intentionally torture the text, twist it.
They most definitely did. This passage is extremely important. First of all, the word for existing is a participle. It is a present participle. It is ongoing. He eternally existed in the morphe tou theou, the morphe of God, the form of God. Mm-hmm. That's important. Remember that it says he existed in the form of God, not saying that at some point in the past he existed, he came into existence in the form of God. No, it just simply asserts that in eternity past, he existed in the form of God, because we're going to run into that term in just a moment, and it's going to be very, very important. Then when it says he did not give consideration, he did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped. Of course, the people who deny the deity of Christ say, well, what this is, of course, is that he didn't even consider trying to become equal with God. People who deny the deity of Christ say, this is what it's talking about. He wasn't equal with God, and he did not give consideration to trying to become equal with God. Well, there's a bunch of problems with that. First of all, nobody is ever said to exist in the form of God, the morphe tou theou, other than God himself. Angels don't have the form of God. Only God has the form of God. But
I remember a Jehovah's Witness in a laundromat once telling me
saying that the angels exist in the form of God, which is allegedly just spiritual. But we're going to see that there's a problem with that. Two ways of what I like to do is I like to say there are two ways of understanding verse 6 and then close the door once I get down to verse 7. One is this concept of those who deny the deity of Christ, saying he didn't try to become equal with God. And the other is he eternally existed equal with God, but did not consider that something that he had to hold on to at all costs. Okay? And I don't try to answer that question yet. I want to go on and get a little bit more of the passage to lay the foundation. But he made himself of no repute, as you used at the kenosis passage, the Greek term kanao that's used here. He emptied himself, doing what? Taking the morphe of a servant, the form of a servant. Now I asked the Jehovah's Witness, was he truly a servant? If he was truly a servant because he has the morphe of a servant, in verse 6 he had the morphe tu theou, the form of God. And therefore, what was he then? All right? He takes the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbles himself, becoming obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. And now let me ask you something. We're talking about humility here. Remember the context I laid? The context I laid was Paul is exhorting the Philippians to humility. Then he gives the example of Jesus Christ. What would be an example of humility? Would it be an example of humility not to be equal with God and not to try to become equal with God? That's humility? To be a lesser being and just seek not to become equal with God? That's not humility. Remember what we said. Humility is having certain rights and laying them aside in the service of others. Would we say that Michael the archangel was humble for not trying to become equal with God? Of course not. Would we say that the janitor in the White House is humble if he does not try to take over the president's office? No, of course not. It would be stupidity for him to do so. In the same way, then, the example here, the context, demonstrates what Paul's talking about. The humility that Jesus shows is due to the fact that he eternally existed in the form of God. But he did not consider that equality with the Father that was his something to be held on to at all costs. What does he do? He lays it aside for what reason? For you and for me. He takes on the form of a servant. He's found in the likeness of man. For what purpose? For the death of the cross. Humility is having rights, but doing what for others? Serving others. What does Jesus Christ do? He gives his life upon Calvary's tree for God's people.
He sheds his blood for their sins, and then 3 days in the grave, rises again for their justification and eternal salvation. And that's the gospel message.
That's the gospel message. And that is why, in verse 9, because of this, God has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name. They put in the word other, every other name, because they want Jehovah's name to stay above Jesus, even though it's not in the text. And then you have verse 10, in order that the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and under earth. Every tongue shall confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, and literally it is that, Kurios Jesus Christos, that Lord is Jesus Christ, under the glory of God the Father. And that is taking from Isaiah chapter 45:23, where Jehovah says, every knee shall bow to me. And so you have the fullness of the entire passage being brought out, demonstrating that Jesus Christ eternally exists in the form of God, yet he takes on the form of a servant, the God-man. It's an example of humility. So obviously he had to have existed equal with God, or the entire example of humility is done away with. There is no example of humility here if you do not understand it in the Trinitarian sense. Paul's making absolutely no sense at all. And it was at that point when I brought out that example of humility, at that one pioneer minister, it's just like, wow, you know, oh no, what am I going to do now? And then when you
thought of that.
I never thought of that. And then when you tie it in with verse 10 in Isaiah 45:23, you have another example where Jesus identifies.
And that falls in line with the very Jehovah's Witness. You know how you were mentioning before, in their own New World Translation and their Kingdom Interlinear, they say that the reason they're inserting this word Jehovah is whenever they find a reference in the New Testament that ties in with the Old Testament, then they can insert Jehovah because it's tying directly to the Old Testament Jehovah or Yahweh,
right,
as you mentioned. Well, this is one passage where they should have followed the rule.
Should have put it in, they didn't.
And they made a mistake, though, if my memory serves me correct, because I remember one Jehovah's Witness I mentioned a moment ago, when I use this passage, and I use it almost to every Jehovah's Witness I deal with, there's a cross-reference here in Philippians 2:10 to Romans chapter 14, verse 11.
Right.
Romans 14:11, it says there, "For it is written, as I live, saith the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God." Isaiah 45:23, the same. So what you have here in the New Testament is a double reference to Isaiah 45:23, according to their own rules, should be translated the way they're doing it as Jehovah.
That's right.
But they put it in Romans.
Right. Right. I know.
They don't put it here because it's too obvious.
We have a tract entitled "Hiding the Divine Name," and the New World Translation. You know, Jehovah's Witnesses are very upset when you say that they're involved in hiding the divine name, but the New World Translation does hide the divine name.
Of course.
For example, in regards to this Jehovah issue, you'll notice at the bottom of their footnotes in their reference edition, they refer to what are called the J documents.
Yes.
The J documents are nothing more than Hebrew translations of the New Testament. None of them are very extreme, are really old. But they use those to say, well, see, these J documents use the term Jehovah here in the New Testament, so we will too. We've documented a number of places where the J documents they drew from identify Jesus as Jehovah. We have the photocopies of where there's the name Yahweh right there in the Hebrew text, identifying Jesus as Jehovah. Like when Paul said no one can say that Jesus is Lord except by the Holy Spirit, some of those J documents say no one can say Jesus is Jehovah except by the Holy Spirit.
And that's what I was mentioning before about their kingdom interlinear on page 18 of their forward. They had the same thing down there in the footnotes.
Right.
I remember, I didn't bring it with me today. I didn't know we were going to do this show. But
there are many passages like this that you can share with people.